everybody who comes to the university, they want some sort of hope. And often we talk about all the depressing stuff. There is no hope, you know. So is there hope? Is there hope for democracy? What should we be thinking of in terms of going forward? So we have this excellent panel. I want to first introduce Claudia Matthes, professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. She does extensive work on European integration and has done extensive work also on comparative democracy studies. She is the chair, the democracy chair of Circle U, and a very good colleague of mine, and has said yes to attend at very short notice. So thank you, Claudia. And then we have Hilde Knutsen, who is best known perhaps in this country as our former Minister of International Development. She's currently with the European Institute of Peace, and she's had all these leadership positions in the UN, the deputy head of UNICEF, Hilde?
Deputy head.
The deputy head. And what I particularly want to say about Hilde is that when she was minister, she used to often come to the university to give lectures for her students, and sometimes we'd go out for a beer, which the students really liked. So we need more of those politicians. And she's also written extensively on Sudan and the peace process. Marianne Dahl is from the Peace Research Institute. I was going to introduce her as a rising star, and then I realized she's already a star. She's just been appointed research director of PRIO and has done extensive work on autocratic politics, mobilization, post-conflict peace, etc. So welcome, Marianne. And then last but not least, my colleague Henrik Knutsen. What can I say about him? He has achieved quite a lot in the last 10 years. I mean, he's very young, and he's one of the world's leading scholars on democracy. So to have you here, all of you, is a great, great pleasure. We will also ask for questions. You'll have 10, 15 minutes towards the end to ask questions, short questions, comments. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to get the online audience, which I'm told is from all over the world, including in Europe, to be able to ask questions at this stage. So we'll just limit it to those who are present here. Okay, so let's get started. I want to start with Claudia, and I'm looking at you there, Claudia. Hope you can see me. You're sitting in Berlin today. In Oslo, we just got some snow. It's cold. It's rather miserable outside. How are things looking in terms of democracy in Europe? Because when we often talk about democratic backsliding, we talk about Africa and Latin America and Asia. There's a lot of stuff happening in our own backyard. And given your research on Poland, on Hungary, East Central Europe, give us a little sense from Berlin. How is the picture in terms of democracy in Europe?
Yeah, good morning to everybody, and I'm really delighted to be part of this panel and to discuss these issues, because they are indeed very pressuring questions. And if we consider what is going on within Europe, if we look at some of the member states, I mean, we just had the vote of non-confidence in France, so we don't know what the maybe new prime minister will bring. And we have several other challenges within member states. So therefore, indeed, Dan, the question that you raised in the beginning, is there hope for democracy? We can at least compile a lot of issues where we can say, well, there's maybe not that much hope, and where we observe democratic regression. Two countries I have done a lot of research on, namely Poland and Hungary, are for several years already in decline when it comes to democracy. For Hungary, it is very severe, so the country is no longer considered to be a democracy, especially after they changed their constitution, and several ordinary pieces of legislation have also made it more difficult to really implement checks and balances and to have self-administration on various levels of governance. Now with Poland, of course, due to the elections last year, we can have a glimpse of hope, but we also see how difficult it is after a period of democratic regression, which means, if we look at the definition, a period in which a government increases executive power and diminishes the possibilities for the parliament, for political opposition, for any kind of self-administration, self-governance to actually try to defend democratic principles and civil liberties. So when these processes become more manifest and also more severe due to legislative and constitutional changes, then we can see how difficult it is, even after a change in government, to return to the path of democracy. And this is what the Polish government is now struggling with, to rechange the country with means that are within the limits of the rule of law. And we also see a lot of problems around Europe, just thinking about the demonstrations in Georgia and the attempts of the civil society to keep their government on the European path. In Germany, we will have elections, most likely early elections in February. We also have our share of right-wing and a new party that is pro-Russian, where ideologically it is not so easy to situate it on a left-right scale. So we will also have a lot of problems.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. I mean,
yes?
we can return to some of these issues later, and I think Poland is something we can return to, because I just saw there's some progressive legislation. I think there's a bill for same-sex, marriages, etc. So it's a little sort of a mixed bag, isn't it, Poland? But we can return to some of these. I want to ask our panelists here, and I want to start with Marianne, to reflect a bit on this democratic peace idea. So we are having this democratic recession, even in Europe, and democratic peace has been such an important part of our lives, at least the last 50, 60 years, right? But that is being challenged, and from the Peace Research Institute's perspective, how should we tackle this idea that democracies usually don't fight each other?
Okay, so we definitely find ourselves in the midst of this autocratic wave, where democratic institutions have been eroded and diminished in several countries for a long period now. But that doesn't really challenge the democratic peace. Mm-hmm. The democratic peace is profoundly about democracies really fighting wars against each other. And even though there are some exceptions to this rule, or at least the tendency, it's still the case that it's very, very seldom that two democracies fight each other. So what we're going to see, of course, if we continue to think that this tendency or this relationship holds with fewer democracies, of course, that poses a huge problem, because it means that relationships that were previously secure are not anymore. So we don't really know the outcome of this. So there are very few positive things to say about the current autocratic wave. But maybe one of the few things is that it's going to create some interesting data points. So to make it possible to test the extent that we can believe in this idea, that the democratic peace is about something directly about the institutions and the norms and the cultures that democracies provide, because we now have these countries that have been democracies, but are switching maybe back to autocracies, which means that is that going to change the relationship they had, which was previously quite good with some neighbors that continue to be democracies? Or is it not? But that's also the only positive thing I have to say about the current autocratic wave.
But if you just go back to, and I'll bring Hilde and Henrik into the conversation, if you think about the justifications for this idea of democratic peace, one is the normative justification, that elected leaders in a democracy, they are socialized into democratic norms, they behave in a democratic way at home, and they also behave in that way, hopefully, in the international arena, right? So there's trust and respect for the leaders of other democracies, and there's some sort of predictability that if this can happen or can't happen in our country, it's most likely the case it can't happen in another country, something like that, right? And then there's also this accountability that there are institutions, that's the institutional sort of justification. We are held to account. Ministers, former ministers are held to account for what they did. And so you think there's predictability, right? So that is what holds it together. But we're thinking about this new situation of geopolitical change. We have the rise of the global south. Increasingly, the global order is fragmented. It's not the same as has been the case all these years ago. We have new actors. We have China's and India's and South Africa's. We have Russia there, you know. New forms of alliances are forming, which is challenging. So, you know, sometimes you could be a democracy and siding with other democracies. In other cases, as Ukraine shows, you're siding with non-democracies. So those alliances are changing. I wanted to bring Hilde into the conversation. How do you see that, particularly, if I can ask you, please, to reflect from the African continent's perspective? I know you've been thinking a lot about that of late, Hilde.
Well, I think just my approach to the whole theme is that from a common sense approach, or common sense thinking, there is a greater chance that war will be avoided when more people are brought into decision making. For me, it's just kind of a factual issue. So it's also important to avoid this becoming, you know, too much of a theoretical discussion. But if you're looking at the issues that you were referring to, namely that leaders a priori are, you know, sensible when they are being elected, all good things happen, you know, that doesn't hold water, basically. But the fact still stands, in my view. When more people are there, when there's more accountability, it is less likely to lead to war. Now, what does this tell us about the African context? So in the 90s, when I was minister, it's a long time ago, following 92, 95, 96 onwards, there was something we called the African Renaissance, or it actually was President Clinton, that called it the African Renaissance, which basically was a wave of new leaders coming in, young new leaders that actually were in favor of democratic elections, and in many countries this happened. Ironically, all these presidents are still there. So they were in favor in theory, but not necessarily in practice, and the elections that are conducted are elections that basically they control. So that being said, there's two main trends on the African continent at the moment. One is a rising of the people's power, of the streets, of their willingness to make use of democratic opportunities and to actually use that to get change of leadership, to get reformed leadership in. Examples, at the moment, we have two elections that just have happened. Mozambique is one. The people on the streets have not given up. It's a huge wave going on. Kenya, a lot of demonstrations after elections at the disappointment with the leader. And you have huge popular risings that are driven by social media, where they're using the opportunity to try to change things. At the same time, you have successful examples where Botswana, surprise election, the country that was holding power forever after, since the liberation of the country, now the vote, totally transparent and free and fair election, led to a change of government and a surprise president who's reform-oriented is there. People wanted change. Same in Senegal, where Macky Sall's attempt at controlling the election, waiting with it until he could make sure he got back in, was actually trumped by people and by a constitutional court that with its independence worked. And so they are now two people in charge of this Senegal, this country, president and prime minister, successful parliamentary elections just a couple of weeks ago, and they are reforming the country. And this would never have happened unless the people made use of these tools. So it's a hugely important and positive development. And on the other hand, I know I'm speaking a bit too long, so on the other hand, the other wave is the Sahel, and is the backsliding of basically not only democracy, but a move towards autocracy with coups. I think it's now 7 countries, and where the French colonial power is one of the huge former colonial power is one of the huge triggers. And the French are now basically kicked out of virtually all the Francophone countries they used to not control, but they had a significant influence in these countries. So that is also happening. And of course, the trend is more autocracy also on the African continent. But I wanted to try to show you a few examples of what positive developments we're seeing.
And we need those positive examples, but the point about democratic backsliding is the perfect point to ask Henrik to come into the conversation, because as Hilde and also Claudia mentioned, I mean, you know, in our backyard, also in some other parts of the world, it's a mixed bag, but you have been doing this really great research with VDEM, and some of the concerning trends is that, well, is it over 70% of the world's population that lives in a non-democracy right now? And that kind of trend is accelerating. So give us a little sense of democracy backsliding. What is happening? Because we all think that democracy is the best. So why is this not persuasive enough for the rest of the world? What's going on?
Well, you have to persuade a lot of people to give up power. I mean, so individually, if you have a clear ideological vision, or you just like power, kind of my ideal system would be one system where I control things. The worst system would be one done where you control things, or kind of anyone else. It's somewhere in between is democracy, right? Where we share power and negotiate. And I mean, so there are. I mean, whenever you have power concentrations, I think it's kind of democracy is a hard system to maintain in one sense, in that there are kind of many actors with incentives to try to institute their own kind of favored authoritarian regime. It's often not presented as an authoritarian regime. You might come in saying that you want to hold elections that are free and fair, and but when push comes to shove, kind of if you allow powerful elites to control power, there is a risk that they will kind of build down democratic institutions. So I think that's an element. So you're in a sense you're starting from a point of departure where kind of this is a hard system to maintain. On the other hand, if you look across different types of political systems, there are very few that are more stable than democracies. So it's actually it's hard to maintain any political system indefinitely. So authoritarian monarchies are very stable. So they're basically the only competitors in terms of stability with democracies. So there are things with democracy, so both in terms of kind of the inherent legitimacy it often has in the population, the fact that it produces kind of a way for elites to resolve conflicts without fighting. So we can hold elections, and I might lose to Marianne now, but I know that I'll be back and beat her in 4 years, so I'll leave my guns at home, right? So there are things that also make democracies fairly stable. So I don't think we should overstate their fragility either. So that was a kind of long-winded start to this. But in terms of the trend, so a couple of hobby horses first. I like to think of democracy as a continuous scale. I mean, so I like to think that kind of a country such as North Korea is less democratic than Hungary. Well, you could still call Hungary now authoritarian, and Hungary is in turn less democratic than Norway. So you have a scale. Then, of course, depending on where you put the threshold on that scale, you can say 70% of people live in autocracies and so on. I just wanted to note that in terms of the measure that is used in the VDEM Institute report, based on the VDEM data, uses a fairly high threshold for categorizing countries as democracies. So it's kind of conservative in the sense that you need a fairly high threshold.
Let me just add here that one reason why that threshold or the numbers have increased for the non-democratic side is the so-called world's largest democracy. India has been classified as an electoral autocracy.
Yep.
So it's in the autocracy category, not in the democracy. And then you have 1.5 billion people going in.
So that's the main driver behind that number. But it speaks to a more general point that I think is a bit underappreciated more generally. If you look at global averages on different measures, so there are different ways of measuring democracy, but if you focus on free and fair elections as kind of electoral democracy, if you take an average across countries, the trend, there's been a decline since 2012, but it's not as steep as you would have imagined if you listen to academic debate or follow the media. So in terms of the average democracy level globally, it hasn't gone down all that much. It has gone down. If you population weight that average, if you take into account that India has more people than, say, the Gambia, kind of moving in the opposite direction a few years back, then the trend looks much more worrying. So it's not only about India, so India is a main driver, but there are other large, populous, and also quite powerful countries that have unfortunately gone in the wrong direction. In different regions of the world, right? And you've had worries even in countries such as the US, Brazil. I mean, you can look across Asia as well. There are large countries. So this is kind of both worth noting that the trend isn't as large as we might think when we look at the media, and large countries are reported. But it's also worrying in the sense that what happens in these big countries has much bigger spillover potential than what happens in smaller, less powerful countries. So what happens in Russia or what happens in Turkey is much more likely to affect regional and even global trends going onward. So this is my biggest worry with the current decline in democracy, is that it might be perpetuated simply by the fact that some key players are shifting political systems.
That's a good point. I want to pick up also on something else you said, that democracy is very good at processing conflicts. This is also an argument that the democracy theorist Adam Brzezowski makes, right? So the idea that the definition of democracy as in an incumbent losing election and willingly relinquishing power, which was not the case in the US a few years ago, but the fact that we have elections as the biggest mechanism for resolving conflicts, right? But there are also courts, there are trade unions, negotiations. There are so many mechanisms that democracy has. So that would be one of the sort of added values, one of the many added values, that we can resolve conflicts peacefully. But given the geopolitical changes, I want to bring all of you in now, isn't that being sort of tested? Because our alliances often are perhaps dependent on trade, economy, we want cheap products, we are trading with countries that are not necessarily democratic, our solidarity, our support may change. Again, just to continue on the India example, so on the one hand, India is a part of the BRICS, right, collaborating with China, but India is very close to the US in terms of democracy promotion, is a part of the Quad, and is not very critical of Russian invasion in Ukraine. So you could have a democracy playing the field, and that could test alliances. Anybody want? Yeah, Hilde?
That's very typical, I would say, because you have the same, South Africa, for example, is playing the same kind of way as India. And if you were in their position, it's smart, you know, because you, from a geopolitical perspective, you're looking at how do I, how does my country survive and thrive? It is not necessarily with aligning yourself with only one bloc. It's playing the field. I'm making sure you have the flexibility. And I think one of the unfortunate things is that the Western countries, in particular the US and a few others, have been misinterpreting the BRICS positions, not all BRICS, but 3 of the BRICS positions and the African countries' positions in the UN on Ukraine very wrongly. They have classified this as Russia-friendly when it actually is an attempt at 2 things: being impartial, and 2, limiting yourself in a geopolitical context so that you reduce your options and align yourself only with one bloc. So it's an impact of the multipolar world and of a very fragmented landscape where you basically want to make sure you have all the options. And so with that, in my view, in particular Africa I know the best, you're driving the countries towards a stronger relationship with Russia and China, because you're saying to them, you are betraying us in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, we're not supporting our position on Ukraine, you're actually saying an invasion is okay. No, you're not. The position they're taking is different. And then you actually risk creating a more polarized world with less influence for the liberal democratic agenda than you otherwise would have.
Claudia, sorry, I haven't got back to you for a while. I saw you have a raised hand. I'm sure you have comments on everything that has been said, but I'd also like to add something else. I know that Germany, your country, is in a bit of an interesting position, trying to balance your relationship with China trade, having a free trade agreement, and being part of the rest of the Western alliance. So any reflections you have, and I also would like to ask Marianne later about NATO, but just, whether we can get into this, because this is one of the criticisms of democratic peace, is that these international organizations like EU and NATO are taking decision-making out of the hands of democratically elected politicians, therefore complicating the picture a bit. Claudia?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, also since last year, Germany for the first time had a national security strategy and also has a new strategy on handling relations with China. And you are fully right. So this is always a delicate balance since, also when Angela Merkel went to China, she met with some opposition or minority representatives. But of course, Germany has huge trade interests, and now with maybe EU also imposing tariffs on, for example, electric vehicles that are produced by German companies in China and are re-imported to the European Union, it gets even a little more complicated. Also, the question is what our most likely next government will do in this respect. I mean, now our foreign minister has just been to China, and she is also trying to somehow manage this very delicate issue. And I mean, another issue where Germany, of course, also has a challenging outreach, because we were just discussing also international responses to the Russian invasion to Ukraine, but there's also the Israel, Gaza, Lebanon and surroundings conflict, where it is often very difficult to follow a differentiated position in international relations, and where, of course, this question of double standards or
hypocrisy,
not hearing other voices is always very easy to tackle.
Yeah, great. Marianne, NATO.
Yes.
Because that is like the elephant in the room, right? This is what we're talking about, and the debate is still about, what will happen. Last month, Donald Trump gets elected, and everybody is worried about, whether he's going to fund NATO at all, he's going to demand reforms, and this is going to have huge implications for the war, whether the U.S. is actually going to provide any aid to Ukraine. Give us your take on NATO.
So, of course, this is deeply worrying from a perspective of most members of NATO, other than the US, maybe, who knows. So a key advantage of having alliances is that when they are stable and when they work, they provide the opportunity that we can provide security without spending as much on defense, not having as many people go into the defense system. So we can do other things which are more enjoyable and better for us. But of course, with Trump coming to power and making it quite unclear what we are going to see in the future, can we still trust that we will get the help from the US if we need that? Will the US remain a member?
But there's less predictability.
Much less predictability. And what we need in the international order is more predictability. And we used to have this situation starting at the end of the 80s and going into the 90s, where there was this consensus growing that we were for democracy and for human rights. And this whole consensus is shifting. It has been for a long, long time. But we see that there are other priorities today than there were before. Yeah. And that combined with the unpredictability is, of course, hugely concerning.
So, Henrik, I mean, if you think about what has happened in the last 8 years in the US, does this affect how we consider, or the rest of the world? We are talking about to make it persuasive, right? That democracy is a good thing. Does this reduce our trust in democracy, that predictability is gone, that we can't count on people, the old alliances are not as stable anymore? You think this is going to shape things up in the next 4 years?
Well, there are kind of many moving parts there, but I think in terms of so the kind of subjective belief in democracy and the stability of these very kind of democracies with a long history, especially in wealthy countries, so what is often called the rich, consolidated democracies. I think most democracy researchers have kind of changed their prior beliefs about kind of exactly how durable, how stable, how predictable are these systems. So I think that's fair to say. I mean, so democracy is a relatively young system, which means, kind of speaking as a social scientist, we have relatively limited data in terms of democracies dying and degrading, especially, so there are many cases, but there aren't that many, especially in wealthy countries with a long history. So again, kind of speaking to this kind of, I can tie the analogy to the democratic peace, because as Marianne started by pointing out, kind of the regularity that democracies fight much more seldom than pairs of democracies and autocracies or pairs of autocracies is super strong. It's one of the stronger we find in the social sciences. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions or that you could quibble about exactly how strong it is, or it might be changing over time. That could be true.
US interference in Latin America over the years? Does that test that notion?
Well, I mean, so you can always, I mean, if your starting point is that, well, this needs to be an iron-tight deterministic relationship, and you play around with the definitions, then of course you can find exceptions. But I mean, that's not how kind of the world is extremely messy. So democracy is certainly not the only thing. You can find exceptions. But I still maintain that in terms of empirical regularities, I kind of challenge you to find kind of other social science regularities that are as strong. That doesn't mean that there are exceptions. So we're, unfortunately for us, the social world is messy. So there are many things playing in. I think the same thing is true with consolidated democracy. If I don't like that term, but in terms of democracies with a long history, they're extremely stable. But due to kind of that we didn't observe countries in, for example, Western Europe then falling, except for kind of invasions during World War II and so on, we've maybe overestimated exactly how durable they are. I think the US shakes that up, kind of showing how a very established democracy can face troubles. It's still a democracy, but I wouldn't bet my house that it's going to be in 20 years. I'd bet quite some money that it's going to survive, but not my house.
Yeah, I think that is the general consensus. I mean, when I was looking at the literature on democratic peace, is that it has a very sturdy relationship, but the questions are arising now because of the geopolitical tensions and new alliances. So, and also trade and other things that are important for us, that maybe we're willing to abandon old friends. So a lot of people are just sort of speculating. Hilde, sorry.
Just a brief two-finger on that, because I think we need to be clear in terms of whether or not we are contesting the empirical regularity or some of the theories that predict that empirical regularity, because there are quite a few theories kind of that point to there being a democratic peace, and you mentioned a couple of them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a main distinction. So you might question some of these kind of peaceful, more norm-driven theories that indicate that this is what is kind of international norms, that this is driving the democratic peace, but there might be other theories that are...
But Hilde, one thing that you touched upon, maybe you want to touch upon again or elaborate a bit, is when you're talking about, you're somehow representing the global South here together with me.
Thank you, that's an honor.
Yeah. So the rise, the global order has changed. These alliances are changing, right? So global South has become a very influential actor. And one of the issues that a lot of leaders really talk about these days is that when Europe talks about its problems, it's supposed to be everybody's problems. But the problems of some of these countries in the global South do not get the attention of the Americans or the Europeans. And this has created this feeling that we need to align ourselves with those who are from the same vicinity, so South-South sort of alliances. Is that something that you're seeing increasingly?
Yeah, that's a very strong feeling. I think the combination of the refocus on, I mean, let me just say, they are also talking about the horrors of what's happening in Ukraine. So it's not as if that's not a topic. However, what they are, it's difficult to call, say they and have the full global South, reflected. There are lots of variations. But let's say one of the trends, is that when this happens, Europe becomes more inward-looking. and systematically. What is being cut is aid. The multilateral institutions are withdrawing. You see a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Sudan, which probably will be 24 million people close to starvation very soon. It's almost at the same level as China's historic,
famine.
And we are looking at Ukraine. And of course Gaza. And the other element that's coming in terms of humanitarian assistance, the other element that is coming in is, one is the inward-looking focus on the European problem. The other is, of course, what they see as a double standard with the way Europe is tackling Gaza. Now, Norway is an exception here, I would say, but the generic trend in Western countries in terms of how it deals with the Palestine crisis really is making the global South furious. And it's really exasperating what is already a big gulf between, a big hole between the global South and the Western countries. And Gaza is really, really playing into this very strongly. And so what you are going to see is if the Western countries is not repositioning this, they're going to see a stronger alliance in the direction of China and Russia with a lot of the global South countries further away from the Western countries. Now, in my view, Norway's position on this is a personal view, is that Norway's positioned itself in a very good way in the sense that they can intervene in this environment and have much more credibility with the global South than they otherwise would have had.
And Claudia mentioned, and I think you're also alluding to, the double standards and hypocrisy. That is something
it's a very strong feeling.
That there's the feeling. Claudia, sorry, I didn't see you. Your turn, please.
Actually, I had a bit of a different point.
Yeah, please. Okay, go ahead.
I rather wanted to stress something about inside the European Union.
Okay.
Maybe we can also get back to these other aspects in the discussion, but something, because there was also this, the mentioned predictability, and you mentioned courts. And so by everything that we can, of course, also criticize about the European Union and certain problems with really implementing democratic standards inside the European Union, on the other hand, and this is maybe a bit of hope, that it also does protect in various ways attempts to defend a democracy from below. So I just wanted to highlight the important role of the European Court of Justice, especially in the cases of Poland and Hungary, but also in some other countries, when it comes to opportunities to get your certain rights protected in Luxembourg. And that this is, of course, something that we have to much lesser extent on the international level, and also with the United States, so where we have this problem of anarchy, but that this could maybe also be something to work on in the future. And maybe this can also relate back to Gaza and Israel and the question of what the International Court of Justice can actually do in this respect.
Okay, we have around 5-10 minutes. Just if you have any questions, just prepare. If you have any comments, I'll get back to you in 5 minutes from now. But I wanted to ask all four of you about a friend of ours, Francis Fukuyama, who in 1989 wrote this very influential essay, which became a book called The End of History and The Last Man. And basically the argument was that, democracy had won over communism and fascism. And democracy was going to be the only game in town. And it was this idea that all countries wanted democracy. This was going to be wonderful. And in hindsight, of course, it has been much discussed, criticized, praised, whatever. And a couple of years ago, and I was talking with him on my podcast, I asked him if he regrets, if there's anything he'd like to change. And the only thing he said, I'm largely stick by my theory. The only thing I didn't predict was the rise of China, that and this is going back to you, Henrik, that Frank and many others say that democracy is really what people, everybody, we all want to live in a democratic society. It's more appealing, right? We like the smell of democracy. But China and its economic success has astounded the world. What is your take on that, Henrik?
No, so that's a good point, and I mean, being kind of so the way the end of history is often presented, and I mean it's partly Francis's own fault when calling it the end of history and the way it's kind of formulated in the title and the short version. But if you go in and read, it's much more nuanced and the caveats and so on. So some of the arguments, mechanisms that are in there on the kind of why democracies are so popular, the description of history, kind of why we might expect trends. There are some very powerful forces there that I think are kind of very kind of accurately described, but it's of course very, very optimistic and trying to push a point, but it's more nuanced than it sounds, that's for sure. In terms of specific points where there are divergences, I think the rise of China is certainly one. So also by kind of presenting a model of economic development over several years, even though there are caveats and things to discuss there as well. I think another major point is kind of so Russia having had less economic success, but having had kind of tremendous political both will and to some extent success also in using the muscle that it has in interfering in different countries and actually playing an important role in influencing regime developments in the neighborhood and further abroad. So there are these kind of international actors that are quite powerful, even if communism is gone in its kind of original form. There are still powerful actors with autocratic regimes that are kind of willing to throw their weight around and kind of act as a counterweight on questions of democratization in smaller countries, for example.
So one of the criticisms, again, of this, actually, of Fukuyama thesis comes from the one of the 3 Nobel Prize winners in economics this year, Daron Acemoglu. And some of the criticism, and this goes back to my earlier point about, Americans wanting to spread democracy abroad, is this preaching, we have to be democratic. The criticism is that it's this idea of modernization. All societies have to go through certain phases, there's a sequencing, you need to have certain institutions in place, and it'll all become democratic. And the criticism is that you can't really build states from the outside. Right? And Afghanistan is a good case, right? One tried for 20 years, did not work. Wanted you to reflect a bit on that, Marianne, if you're interested. The state building and the role of external actors in some of these conflict societies. Do we have any success stories of this working? Maybe you want to also talk about Sudan.
Okay, so that's really far from what I'm working on, because what I'm working on is people power. So people trying to build democracy from the streets.
Civic participation,
yes,
right?
Which is kind of the opposite of trying to build democracies from the outside. And what the data shows is that it tends to succeed much more often when it's built from the inside. That doesn't mean that outside actors cannot help and that there haven't been successful interventions. But for democracy to survive and be built and consolidate, it has to be the will of the people. And we have research spanning political science and sociology and economics showing that when people take to the streets and demand democracy, it has this impact on the trajectory that the country for the country, and it tends to become more democratic and more stable than it would have been otherwise.
So coups can actually sometimes be good.
Yes,
it's not always bad, right?
No, definitely, and it can remove autocratic leaders, and especially those who have been in power for a long, long time. But mostly when it's combined with mass mobilization, so people taking to the streets and ensuring that this opening, this window that we see, is used for something, building democratic institutions, and not just another autocrat in town.
Hilde, quickly, we'll take some questions soon.
Sudan is the perfect example of how a social revolution, which happened, a huge people's revolution in 2019, led to a compromise declaration between the civilian forces and the military, who had made a coup against Bashir. And then you have a mixed bag kind of government, which was supposed to have a civilian leadership after a 2-year transition period. Of course, the generals didn't want it. When they were threatened with, with some important measures that the government wanted to take, they made a coup. And now there's a civil war between the two generals that were in the Sovereign Council, the leader and the deputy leader. And there's a full-scale civil war, as we know. And the reason why this is a typical example is that there's two very important factors that we need to reflect on in this context. One is what we've seen, at least constantly in these situations, in the social mobilization of the people's power, at least on the African continent, is that they are mobilized by social media, but they struggle with finding a leadership structure that makes it possible for them to capitalize on that power properly and really make it happen and really make it relevant in the negotiations with the leaders. So in the Sudanese case, it was the resistance committees, and they had a flat structure, and they did not want a leader. The same in Kenya. They're all having problems with that. What happens then is that they lose power, and the opportunity they really have to make that impact and to, for example, prevent that coup from happening, because they were among the biggest threats to the generals. They were very, very, very afraid of the people in the streets because they could almost face the tanks. I mean, they were very courageous, but they were not organized. And so one of these important things now, I think, in terms of how one can support the democratic movements around the world is to help them learn democratic tools in terms of how you organize yourself, how you create a leadership structure that is working for everyone and that can really be representative. So that's just one additional point I wanted to make.
Great. We have 10 minutes. And are there any questions, comments from... Yeah, please use the microphone and short and sweet comments and questions, please.
Thank you. I have a question about kind of the premise of the democratic peace. So if you say that democracies tend not to wage war against each other, that kind of sounds like, given that there's only interstate wars, but we also know that civil wars happen more frequently than wars in between states now. So my question is, say that there's ethnic or either ethnic or socio-economic divisions within a country. What are the chances of democracy waging kind of war on itself? Even if that country is a democracy, is the democracy kind of strong enough to put a damper on those conditions, because civil war is more frequent than interstate wars?
Okay, we'll hold that. Yes, sir?
Hi, I also wonder about the democratic peace. I'll try to be short and sweet. Why is the democratic peace a better explanation than a hegemonic peace? Doesn't the hegemonic peace explain more?
Okay, any other comments, questions? No? And forever we shall be quiet, so then we have lots of time. Who would like to go here? Marianne, Henrik, you want to go first? Please.
Yeah. Marianne.
Okay, so I thought I could say something about the democratic civil war piece, or are democracies less likely to end up in a civil war? And the empirics there tells us that yes. And it tends to be that full democracies and full autocracies are the ones least likely to end up in wars. When we look at these in-between countries, which is a big share of countries that are semi-autocracies or semi-democracies, we see that the institutions do not really balance in each other in a way that makes civil war less likely. But in democracies, we probably see the same mechanisms that work at the international scale, that all this accountability and these more inclusive institutions means that there are other ways to wage conflict than ending up in a war.
So now I start regretting that I didn't go first.
You're so polite, Henrik.
Actually worked on this question with Marianne's husband, actually, on a research paper on this kind of civil democratic...
I forgot that,
yeah.
Yes.
So, and Marianne is, kind of gives a very good overview of it. It's actually kind of so thinking about autocracies on the other hand, kind of where you have the possibility to repress dissent, that might actually then also quell kind of civil wars, simply because you repress very efficiently, and you can't do this in these kind of mixed regimes, these more semi-democratic situations. But the most peaceful, if you go by the statistics, going back to 1800, that is, as Marianne says, these very democratic countries seldom experience civil wars. But again, I think it's worth remembering that these are kind of statistical relationships. So it doesn't mean that you will never have a situation that is so tricky to resolve that even a very kind of well-functioning democracy won't end up in a civil war. But think of it in terms of statistical probabilities. And also, if you want to reduce the risk of civil war by the institutional setup, kind of a very democratic country is as good a bet as you can get. Now, if I can kind of go to the hegemonic versus democratic piece, I think it's a hard question to answer on different levels. So I think these are not mutually exclusive explanations for sure, and they could both work and interact. But it's hard so then you have to think very carefully through, okay, so what are the predictions that you would expect from a theory of hegemonic peace versus democratic peace? So on the hegemonic peace side, you would expect, for example, particular periods of time in international history to be more peaceful than others when you have more contestation. And you can observe that this fluctuates in a sense. The democratic peace actually gives you predictions across different periods of time. So during hegemonic period and non-hegemonic period, you would expect to see kind of democracies not fighting each other, and this is actually what you observe. So in a sense, both could be right. I think the empirical evidence is much stronger for the democratic peace, and that's basically because you only have so many periods of international history where you have data. It's harder to kind of test and assess, whereas pairs of democracies and autocracies, there are so many. So it's easier basically to have observations that allow you to test the theory.
Hilde?
Bring in another South perspective on this, because one of the aspects of this is on the first question, on civil war in, for example, an African context. You seldom have parties with ideological differences that compete in elections. You often have ethnically based or identity-based parties, which again can exaggerate the differences between different parties, so that you increase the ethnic competition. Now, democracy, for example, in the case of Kenya, can provide a division, a division of labor, but very often between, and a division of power between the different ethnic groups, but very often it's a winner takes it all. So I'll just bring in also the perspective of the electoral system, because democracies is not democracies. So proportionate election systems forces negotiations and a division of power between the different forces. If you have the winner takes it all system, which is the British largely electoral system, it is really dangerous and it can be destabilizing. And then it actually can fuel the fire and lead to violence. Kenya, 2007, for example. And if the elections again are stolen, which also happens in democratic countries, then, these problems can increase. So I just wanted to make the point that I think your points are really valid in terms of solid, anchored, representational, proportionate electoral systems of really anchored democracies. But when you're in a fragile democratic situation, elections and too early elections after conflict, for example, after a peace agreement, can really be dangerous because you'll trigger all these different tensions and people will actually end up fighting and not using the political arena, political competition, but weapons. That's just a point that needs to be made.
We have 2.5 minutes. Claudia, you get 30 seconds, and then I have just one final thing to ask you guys. So go ahead, Claudia.
Yeah, I also just wanted to stress the relevance of institutions. Elections were just mentioned, and of course we have other mechanisms of conflict resolution. And if we think about European countries like Northern Ireland, if we think about Spain, if we think about some activists in France from Corsica, etc. So we do have internal conflicts, and then the question is, how good are institutions to regulate and mediate them or not? And we also see varieties within democracies.
Great, thanks. So the final set of, well, one thing I wanted to ask you guys is if you can speculate, and we have 2 minutes, on Ukraine, the next 4 years with the Trump presidency. What is your best bet? Are we going to see the conflict achieving a resolution? Are we going to still be in the flux situation we are in now? Henrik first.
Oh.
Yeah.
One thing
30 seconds.
This is a hard one, and it's a super important one, because I think the outcome of this conflict is going to be so important for kind of both peace and stability, but also democracy globally. If I were to speculate, I think there would be a kind of attempts at negotiations and some kind of, I wouldn't say that you would have the same conflict situation constantly throughout the 4 years, although I'm not sure, but seeing a perfect resolution is also hard. So somewhere in the middle with attempts at negotiations, but kind of the possibility of recurrence. But it's so hard.
I know. That's why we are speculating.
Yes.
Marianne?
Well, I'm still struggling to accept the outcome of that of the Trump election. So I've been trying not to think too much about it. But I think Karl-Henrik is right. We're probably going to see attempts at negotiations. But that's kind of how far I can speculate. Like, who knows how that's going to end up? Hopefully it becomes something more peaceful for the next 4 years than what we have seen for the 2.5 last ones.
Okay, Claudia?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical. I mean, 2 players have been mentioned already, Russia, Trump, and I also don't know what exactly the position of our next German government. Germany is the 2nd largest supporter, despite the debate about Taurus and other weapons. So I don't think it will become easy.
So, Hilde, you have the last word. Are you going to be optimistic?
Unfortunately, no. I think whatever happens, probably negotiations will start. We've seen the signals very often. You know, you get to a point in peace processes where one calls that the conflict is becoming immature. It's a terrible word, by the way. But that there's, on both sides, they're getting tired. They're losing resources. They're losing, they don't have enough forces to continue, and they kind of end up needing to negotiate. But I think whatever outcome is not going to be stable, and I think we'll have a continued aggressor, if I may use that term, which will try to undermine whatever is agreed, because that outcome will never suffice to accommodate what Putin wants. So he will be a restless and active power that will try to undermine whatever is agreed, I think.
Okay.
Unless the Putin regime collapses, which is also a possibility.
That is, I think that's what a lot of people are hoping for. So that is the optimistic take I had. Thank you very much for coming to this event as part of Oslo Peace Days. And an excellent panel. Thank you, Claudia, Hilde, Karl-Henrik, and Marianne. I also wish to thank Elise, Bella, all the others who put this event together. Please remember there are many other events as part of our Oslo Peace Days series, here, outside, all over. It's all on the website. Again, thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy Christmas. Have a wonderful life. Thank you.